Good morning, folks. We're going to be speaking more on informal logical fallacies. Recall we'd already started talking about a list that are sometimes called fallacies of presumption. I want to lecture on the rest of those fallacies from that list. I also am going to explain to you the ones that I'm not going to be emphasizing on quizzes or examinations. And it's because these are ones that don't fit on most traditional fallacies lists, but also because once we move a little bit forward, we'll see that some of these fallacies might have better descriptions and a better breakdown elsewhere. Now, before I address those last fallacies, I wanted to talk about an approach to dealing with arguments like the ones you see at the end of the chapter. Now, my approach to dealing with those arguments is, of course, you begin by reading the argument. Now, if indeed the structure of the argument is not apparent to you, do what we did in an earlier chapter. In other words, see if you can determine what is the conclusion that the arguer is trying to lead you to draw. Can you identify the conclusion? And of course, you know what's coming next. Can you identify the premise or premises? In other words, can you identify what the supporting reason or reasons are that the arguer is giving in order to support the conclusion? If it helps, and I do this frequently, see if if you're not understanding the argument, see if you can restate it in your own words. See if you can restate the argument in your own words. That way you might be able to make it clearer exactly what the conclusion the arguer is trying to draw and what the premises are. And if you can see things more clearly, you might be able to see whether or not there is, in fact, one of the fallacies committed or not. Now, that's typically what I do, and it's actually a little easier than it sounds. Now, let's move along. We already talked about the appeal to authority or the appeal to questionable authority. We talked about the straw argument as well as the false dilemma. I want to talk about inconsistency. It may seem strange to have inconsistency on an informal fallacy list because inconsistency actually has a formal problem. And if you don't recall what I'm talking about, to be inconsistent basically means to do what? Yeah, to contradict oneself. And remember, we talked about a contradiction when we were looking at propositional logical analysis. To be inconsistent would be literally to say, to argue both P and not P. And remember, this statement is necessarily false. And if it's necessarily false, there's a logical problem. So it's a formal problem. Now, why is our textbook discussing inconsistency as an informal problem? Well, what the author's trying to get at is that inconsistency is seldom laid out in this way. In other words, inconsistencies are often not what? They're often not obvious. They're often not telegraphed. In other words, you need to read the argument to determine whether or not an inconsistency has taken place. And inconsistencies are oftentimes very, very subtle. And I'll go for the low-hanging fruit example that the author of the text puts it. Frequently, politicians hide inconsistencies in their policy statements in the rhetoric. If a politician were to say, I am for massive sweeping tax cuts that will reduce federal income, but yet they're going to claim to do what? We're going to increase spending in this, and this. Even though the person isn't saying, oh, I'm being inconsistent. They're basically saying, we're going to reduce revenue, but we're not going to reduce revenue, because you can't reduce revenue if you expect to fund an expanding set of programs. Now, indeed, the person is not being blatantly inconsistent. You have to read between the lines. And by the way, if they're not being inconsistent, they better have good reasons for explaining how they're going to come up with the money, which typically, they'll evade the issue or something like this. Yeah, inconsistencies often have to be inferred or read into by the person listening or reading the argument. Now, the author of the text also explains sometimes an inconsistency shouldn't be labeled as fallacious. And that would be in these kind of cases. Suppose that some person did, in fact, change their mind over time, where at one point they took this position, at another point they took this position, and you say, hey, this person's been inconsistent. And the phrase that was used about 10 years ago in American politics was to dismiss someone as a flip-flopper. Well, he took this position, and now he took this position. He must be full of crap. He must have been full of crap in the first place. Well, the author contends if a person did indeed change their mind over time for a good reason, in other words, if they were ignorant at one time and now they are slightly more enlightened, we shouldn't hold it against that person. As a matter of fact, we should call that intellectual growth. So yeah, changing your mind doesn't necessarily make one guilty of inconsistency. It may mean that you change your mind for a good reason. Now, we would have to look into your reasons, because indeed, politicians oftentimes change their mind for self-serving reasons. This is why sometimes you need to dig deeper if you want to know what position someone is really taking. Next. Begging the question. The author talks about a separate version that the author is going to lump into the same label as begging the question. This is where the author also talks about something called evading the issue. Now, admittedly, evading the issue is a little bit different from the traditional interpretation of begging the question, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, folks, I'm sure you've heard the phrase to beg the question or to question beg, but it is seldom clearly explained what it means to do that. When we beg the question, folks, what a person does in their argument is they will state a premise that will typically support a conclusion that sounds very much like, guess what? Almost identical to the premise. They will state a premise, and then they will draw a conclusion almost the same as the premise. Or to state in another way, they'll tell you that you should accept a particular conclusion, and then the premise that they'll give for the conclusion will be pretty much a restatement of the conclusion that they just said that you should draw. Now, the idea here is, if the premise is not obviously true, if it has underlying assumptions that the listener or reader must make in order to accept the premise, the person stating the argument actually should undertake the burden of proof and explain why the premise and thus the conclusion are justified. To merely state a conclusion and then restate the conclusion as if it were its own premise, without any further qualification, is to beg the question. And the thing is, it imports, assumptions that may not be readily apparent. Now, the low-hanging fruit example that the textbook uses is where a person says, yeah, you know how I know that the Bible is the true word of God? Well, they say, well, it says in the Bible that it's the true word of God. Now, notice that is self-referential. It already assumes that the Bible is the true word of God. Therefore, to be a non-question begging reason, you've got to go deeper. You've got to explain why I should accept your premise in the first place. Now, as a side note, this version of begging the question that I'm talking about sometimes is given this name in other fallacy lists. It's sometimes also called the fallacy of circular reasoning. Simply put, we argue in a circle when we basically state a conclusion we want our audience to accept, and then we state a premise, which is basically the same thing as the conclusion, as if it were its own reason. Now, I'll give you one that we sometimes discuss in Introduction to Philosophy. Frequently, when we're discussing the problem of free will versus determinism, students will say, well, of course I have free will. I make choices every day, and nobody is stopping me. Now, beware of this. Simply because you make choices doesn't mean that your choices are done without any kind of restraint. In other words, the word choice itself already makes the assumptions of free will without doing what? Without providing any evidence. In other words, it imports certain assumptions that would need further defending. And let me clarify if my example didn't make sense. When people say they make a choice, they typically assume that their choices are not influenced by external factors. When the fact is, external factors are oftentimes internalized. For example, I might decide not to tell lies because of the fear of feeling guilt. Now, the guilt is what does what to me, according to this? It shackles me. It keeps me from being able to do what I might want to do out of fear. This is what we mean by choices aren't necessarily free. You would have to explain why every single choice is indeed internally free. And for those of you who have questions about what I'm talking about, I am also distinguishing between what we call metaphysical freedom versus what we call liberty, political freedom. They are two different concepts. That is something I will bring up when we do a fallacy in the next chapter called equivocation. Words sometimes have more than one meaning, and if we confuse one meaning of a word for another word within an argument, we actually haven't proven anything, because we have been using a mistaken conception or a mistaken definition. Now, what the author calls evading the issue, we will see a little bit later in a chapter on rhetorical language. It will bear similarities to what we will call obfuscation later on. To obfuscate literally means to make opaque. to cover things up. When we obfuscate, we evade an issue either by piling on irrelevant information that doesn't answer a question, or we might answer the question that we wish to have been asked rather than answer the real question. Now, the author calls evading the issue a species of begging the question, because in fact, it imports assumptions that the question has been answered when it was. Yeah, when it hasn't been. Now, to give you one more sort of side issue here, what the author of our text is calling evading the issue also has similarities to what is a concept that is on most informal fallacies lists, called to bring in a red herring. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard that phrase before. Now, to bring in a red herring means to bring something into the conversation that seems germane, that seems relevant to the conversation, but it really isn't. So rather than actually moving us forward in the conversation, it's really just taking us elsewhere. Red herrings are often used intentionally to confuse our audience. Why? If we don't have a proper answer to a question, we might want to change the topic. If we are uncomfortable answering a question, we may want to, using rhetorical sleight of hand, change the subject. A politician, in order to evade perhaps negative flack or feedback from the press or something, may just like to pile on a ton of information. And hopefully, people will be what? Yeah. They'll be oblivious. They'll forget what the original issue was. Problem solved. But yeah, evading the issue occurs whenever someone's been asked something like a question, and then they don't answer it directly. Instead, they'll kind of pretend like they have, but talk about something else. Next. I already talked about the author of our text use of the phrase questionable premise. And I've already told you that I do not want you to use this label, questionable premise. And this is because, in a sense, every single one of these fallacies could be lumped into that broad category of questionable premise. What we are asking you to do here is to get some proficiency at as precisely diagnosing the fallacy as you can. And using an excessively broad category like questionable premise doesn't actually encourage you to do that. And this is why I'm going to ask you not to use it. I also don't like the author of the text definition of questionable premise. It's what I like to call a circular definition. Defining a questionable premise as a case where someone brings in a questionable premise doesn't really seem to cut it for me. Pardon that. Now, folks, the last two fallacies on our list are ones that I am not going to emphasize. This might be good news for you when it comes to taking a quiz on this particular chapter, because I basically suggest I am not going to hold you responsible for all the ones on this list. So it kind of limits, your possibilities. I'm first going to talk about what the author of the text calls suppressed evidence. Now, the fallacy of suppressed evidence is said to occur whenever a person states a conclusion, doesn't matter what the conclusion is, and then they give evidence that is, guess what? The evidence or the premise does indeed support the conclusion. Now, the problem with suppressed evidence isn't what has been said. It's actually what hasn't been said. We suppress evidence whenever we omit any contrary evidence that would count against the thesis. Now, there's a reason why suppressed evidence, and this is another reason why I try not to hold folks to it on a test. Discovering if there is a case of suppressed evidence isn't necessarily an easy thing, because it presupposes that the person doing the evaluating has enough knowledge of the subject to know what is missing. And if you don't happen to be fairly well versed on a particular topic, how could we expect you to know whether or not there's suppressed evidence or not? We'd have to send you out to do your research on it. Now, this is probably another reason why the author of the text would come back and remind us. Expanding your background beliefs with more knowledge is probably one of the best tools to becoming a better critical thinker. Because the more you know about a topic, the more likely you will be to know if something has been conveniently omitted. Now, I just said conveniently omitted. The author of the text does suggest that suppressed evidence is sometimes done intentionally. In other words, you might cherry pick the evidence that would support your case, but you conveniently omit anything that might go against it. Now, the author does also talk about the possibility of suppressed evidence as overlooked evidence. Now, what the author means here is a person might innocently draw a conclusion that she probably shouldn't draw, not intentionally, but the person might be overlooking significant evidence. Now, I want to give you an example from the textbook that I did not assign for just this reason, and I'm going to read it to you. It's number 19 in the problem set. It says, from a New Republic review of the James Michener book, Iberia. This is like 40 years old. Michener leads off his chapter on bullfights with an argument between a quintessential American and a Spaniard about brutal sports, which the Spaniard wins by pointing out that more young men get killed and maimed every year playing American football than in the bull ring. So the argument here is about brutal sports. Whose sports are more brutal? We're to assume that the American here had said bullfighting is a brutal sport, to which the other fellow quipped, hey, far more people get maimed or killed playing American football every year than do people die in the bull ring. Now, guess what? That is relevant evidence. But the author of the text would say there's something seriously wrong in terms of what's being suppressed. And I'll lay it on you. How many more people play American football or involved with American people relative to the number of people involved in bullfighting? In other words, the suppressed evidence is a case of a statistical difference. It is the same sort of suppressed evidence statistical error that people make when they make statements like, it must be a lot more dangerous driving within 15 miles of your home, because most people get into auto accidents within 15 miles of their home. Well, it has nothing to do with the roads near your home being any more dangerous. It has to do with the fact that you are in that locality, percentage-wise, more often than you are elsewhere. Statistically, people get hurt more often on roads that they are unfamiliar with. However, because you're more often on roads that you are familiar with, your odds of getting into accidents are greater there. So yeah, that's sort of the overlooked evidence in those particular kinds of cases. Now, using that example from the textbook, I'm kind of showing you why I'm not a big fan of this fallacy category. Because when we discuss another chapter where we discuss errors in statistical reasoning, we will have a more precise fallacy designation for this. In other words, we will be able to talk about it in terms of it being a misuse of statistics. And you'll notice that's a particular kind of suppression of evidence. So we will have a more specific fallacy designation for a lot of these cases of suppressed evidence as we move forward. Now the last one on the list. This is one I'm also not going to emphasize. It's what the author of the text calls tokenism. Now, one of the reasons I'm not emphasizing it is because it is not on most fallacy lists that I've encountered in any other source. I also don't like the way it's defined in this textbook. Because what word do they use in their definition of tokenism? They talk about mistaking a token gesture for the real thing, for an authentic gesture. Now, of course, that definition doesn't do us much good if we don't know what a token gesture is. Now, when we talk about a token, we speak of something that stands in for something else. A token is oftentimes a symbolic gesture. Back in the day, when people would stay with a company for 35 years and retire, the old cliche was they'd ship you off with a gold watch at the end of your service. Oh, here's a gold watch for the wonderful service you've given us for 35 years. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. In other words, a lot of people are aware that what? These kind of gestures are insincere. Oftentimes, they're just done to make the individual look good or to save face. Or perhaps to dupe you into accepting a gesture like this for genuine goodwill. Politicians and corporations oftentimes engage in this kind of stuff. I'll give you the example from the textbook in outline, which is, I think, a nice example. An energy company that had a very bad environmental record, in fact, was fined for various things. Now, of course, the fact that they got in trouble for things probably wasn't covered in a lot of the mass media, because big energy buys a lot of ads. Probably covered on NPR, but that was probably about it. Now, take a guess what kind of a gesture companies behaving badly oftentimes engage in. They will exercise, or they will engage in a public relations campaign to talk about all of the good things that they are doing in terms of, say, environmental initiatives. Now, of course, it's a token gesture because, number one, they're doing the environmental initiatives because the government is making them do it, but they make it look like what? Yeah, they make it look like it's them doing it freely as an act of goodwill. Now, one of these token gestures can be rhetorically effective if the people who are hearing about the token gesture don't recognize it as one. In other words, if you're not very informed about issues, there's a good chance that these goodwill gestures that are merely token gestures will be mistaken for goodwill gestures. Now, why do you think it is that the author suggests we should be aware of things like this? Because those with power economic, institutional, or otherwise, are oftentimes trying to get the best of us with these kind of PR campaigns. A little healthy cynicism might lead us to dig a little bit deeper to see if these are really genuine acts of goodwill. I'll give you one more easy example. I'm always very cynical about supposedly well-meaning philanthropists, because very often, they will give all this money to various causes. Well, and we forget what they're really doing is they're deciding where their tax dollars will go. Because by doing charitable donations, they have actually used tax loopholes so they can get out of paying actual taxes. And at the same time, they can look like what? Yeah, they can look like they are good public citizens who actually care about things rather than about themselves. Now, I'm not saying there are not people in those high places that don't care about issues. What I'm saying is we should be a little bit cynical before we say, oh, what a wonderful man he is, what a wonderful human being. Well, they may be really just doing a PR campaign. Yes, Mr. Carball.
I was just going to say that tokenism seems a little like the exact opposite of a straw man, because whereas a straw man, you put out a statement that says they're the worst, and tokenism seems like they put out something that says I'm.
Yeah. And by the way,
I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does make some sense, and I think this will be a nice moment where we can tie a couple of things together. Mr. Carball is suggesting that that tokenism sounds a little bit like straw man in reverse. And if I can reiterate the straw man, remember the straw man is when usually an opponent distorts or misrepresents their opponent's position. So when a straw man is set up, the group or individuals being straw manned are not speaking for themselves. In other words, their opponents are putting words in their mouth. Now, in the case of tokenism, and this is why I think your parallel is a fairly apt one. In the case of tokenism, the person doing the presenting of their position is the individuals themselves. And unsurprisingly, they are likely to promote a positive straw man. In other words, they are likely to represent themselves in a much cleaner light than people who actually knew the situation would, or a person who actually wasn't out to do public relations. So this is why Mr. Carball says there seems to be a parallel here, and I agree with him. Tokenism does seem a little bit like a positive straw man to public relate for your own position. Thereby, you distort your actual record or your actual motives to try to make yourself look better, more sincere, etc., etc. I think that was astute, and I hope that I wasn't putting words into your mouth.
No.
But yeah, I think that certainly is worth noting, and I think it's also worth noting here that individuals do sometimes create positive straw men of their own positions. Where you kind of highlight all the good things about your side, where you conveniently you conveniently cover up the blemishes of your own side. Now, of course, that sounds a little bit like intentional suppression of evidence for the purposes of constructing a straw man. I hope I didn't confuse you there. The point I was trying to make in that confusing statement was that very frequently students might see more than one thing going on in some of these arguments and might ask the question, is it all right that I see more than one fallacy perhaps taking place? The answer to that question is absolutely. A passage may commit more than one fallacy. However, what you should probably look for is the main fallacious problem. Do look for what the main problem is. Indeed, there might be other things going on 2. And don't hesitate to ask questions about practice problems when you have them. Thanks.